A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Daniel sent us a prompt today that cuts right through the glossy brochures of international diplomacy. He wants us to look at the actual mechanics of trade missions. We are talking about the on-the-ground operations, the necessity of government leadership, and specifically, the degree to which these missions serve as a high-stakes sales funnel for massive corporations with deep political ties. It is a topic that feels especially relevant now in March of 2026, as we see the global trade landscape fracturing into these very specific, very guarded regional blocks.
It is a timely topic because most people only see the 30-second clip on the evening news of a prime minister or a cabinet secretary cutting a ribbon at a new factory abroad. They see the smiling handshakes, the exchange of pens, and the signed memorandums of understanding, and they assume it is just about general goodwill or broad economic cooperation. Herman Poppleberry here, by the way. What the public rarely sees is that the ribbon-cutting ceremony is usually the final act of a 24-month procurement cycle. It is not the beginning of a relationship. It is the public celebration of a deal that was greased and geared by state power long before the cameras showed up. We often call it the photo op, but in the industry it is known as the contract op.
You're essentially saying that a trade mission is the most expensive, least efficient business-to-business sales meeting on the planet, but it is one where the taxpayer picks up the tab for the venue, the logistics, and the security. It sounds like a massive subsidy for companies that already have billions in the bank.
In many ways, yes. We have to move past the idea that these are purely diplomatic exercises. In the modern era, and especially as we look at the data from 2025 and early 2026, trade missions have evolved into a state-sponsored concierge service for domestic industry giants. There has been a fundamental shift from what we used to call diplomatic bridge building toward what is now better described as export credit-backed market entry. It is a mercenary form of diplomacy where the primary metric of success is not peace or cultural exchange, but the total dollar value of the contract signed before the plane leaves the tarmac.
That is an important distinction. When a government organizes a mission to, say, Brazil, or India, or Vietnam, they are not just taking a random cross-section of the economy, they are curating a specific delegation. I want to dig into how that curation happens. How does a company actually get a seat on the plane? Because it clearly is not a lottery. If I am a mid-sized manufacturer in the Midwest, can I just sign up and expect to be sitting next to the Secretary of Commerce?
It is far from a lottery, Corn. It is a highly vetted, highly political process. If you look at the statistics from G7-led trade missions in the first quarter of 2026, over 65% of those missions included at least one firm that has contributed significantly to the political campaigns of the lead cabinet member heading the mission. That is not a coincidence. It is what I call the access for contract loop. The government leverages sovereign debt, regulatory alignment, and high-level diplomatic pressure to clear paths for specific corporate bidders who are already part of the inner circle. The selection process often happens months in advance behind closed doors. They look for companies that have the scale to execute massive infrastructure projects because those projects make for the best headlines.
So the government acts as the lead generation and the closer for these companies. But why is the government leadership actually necessary? Why can't a massive energy conglomerate or a telecommunications giant just go to a foreign market and pitch their own services? They have their own lobbyists, their own international offices, and their own massive budgets. Why do they need the minister to hold their hand?
They can, and they do, but they lack the sovereign leverage. This is the core of the necessity of government leadership. When a chief executive officer walks into a meeting with a foreign minister, they are just a vendor. They are one of a dozen companies trying to sell a product. But when a cabinet secretary walks into that same room with the chief executive officer standing right behind them, the dynamic shifts entirely. The host country is no longer just looking at a contract for solar panels or fighter jets or 5G infrastructure. They are looking at their broader relationship with a world power. They are thinking about visa programs, intelligence sharing, future trade concessions, and even military cooperation. The corporation is effectively hitching its private profit motive to the wagon of national interest. The government provides a level of legitimacy and implied pressure that no private entity can match.
It is a form of commercial diplomacy where the lines between the public sector and private interests are completely blurred. I was reading about that green infrastructure mission to Southeast Asia back in 2025. If I recall correctly, about 80% of that delegation represented just 3 specific energy conglomerates. They were not there to help small businesses find new markets. They were there to secure multi-billion-dollar utility contracts that were backed by state guarantees. It felt less like a trade mission and more like a state-sanctioned monopoly expansion.
That Southeast Asia mission is the perfect case study. Those 3 conglomerates weren't just selling equipment, they were selling a long-term dependency. And that brings us to the role of export credit agencies, or ECAS. This is the part of the trade mission that rarely gets discussed because it is buried in technical financial filings and dry annual reports. These agencies provide state-backed insurance and financing to de-risk private projects for large corporations. According to the 2025 Global Trade Report, state-backed export credits for large-scale infrastructure projects increased by 14% year over year. When a company joins a trade mission, they are often seeking more than just a handshake. They are seeking the promise that if the foreign project fails, or if the foreign government defaults, or if there is political instability, their own domestic government will step in to cover the loss.
It is a massive hidden subsidy. The corporation gets the upside of the international expansion, the dividends, and the stock price boost, while the public assumes the long-term geopolitical risk. If the deal goes south, the taxpayer is the one who pays out the insurance claim through the ECA, and there is a clear hierarchy within these missions that reinforces this. You have talked before about the protocol gap. Can you explain how that manifests on the ground during one of these trips? Because I imagine the experience of a Fortune 50 CEO is very different from the experience of a small business owner who managed to get a spot.
The protocol gap is where the real business happens, and it is quite stark. A trade mission might have 50 companies on it, but they are not all treated equally. The hierarchy of the delegation dictates who gets the ministerial level meetings and who gets stuck with the desk officers. If you are the chief executive officer of a top-tier defense contractor or a major tech firm, you are in the private room with the minister and the head of the mission. You are discussing regulatory frameworks, long-term strategic alignment, and perhaps even helping to draft the language of future agreements. You are eating at the head table at the state dinner.
And what about everyone else? The other 45 companies?
If you are a small business owner who paid $5,000 or $10,000 to be part of the delegation, you are likely in a hotel ballroom doing speed dating with local distributors who may or may not be interested in your product. You are getting the generic briefing from the embassy staff. You are the window dressing. The smaller firms are essentially the political cover that allows the government to claim the mission is about supporting the whole economy and fostering entrepreneurship, while the real energy and the real resources are focused on the 3 or 4 incumbents who already have the political capital. It reminds me of our discussion in episode 1154 about the Davos disconnect. You have this high-level performative gathering of global elites talking about cooperation, but the actual transactional reality is much grittier, much more exclusive, and much more focused on the bottom line of a few players.
That parallel to Davos is spot on. In Davos, the talk is about saving the world and global cooperation. In a trade mission, the talk is about who gets the contract for the new port facility or the national 5G rollout. But let's look at the other side of this. What about the host country? We often hear that these missions are a win-win, but there is a second-order effect that often gets ignored, the crowding out of local small and medium enterprises in the host country.
When a foreign government brings its full weight to bear to support a specific multinational, it makes it nearly impossible for local startups or smaller firms in that host country to compete on a level playing field. If a local company is bidding against a global giant that has the backing of a G7 government and a multi-billion-dollar export credit guarantee, the local firm has already lost. The trade mission isn't just opening a market, it is often tilting it in favor of the visitor. This creates a cycle of dependency where the host country's infrastructure is built and maintained by foreign giants, stifling local innovation and wealth creation.
And it is not just tilting the market for the duration of the trip. These missions are often used to influence the actual laws and regulations of the host country. We see this with regulatory capture. A company joins a trade mission, gets high-level access, and then uses that access to help draft the very trade agreements or industry standards that will govern that market for the next decade. They are essentially writing the rules of the game while they are playing it.
We saw a lot of that in the tech diplomacy push within the European Union around 2023, and we are seeing the fallout now in 2026 as we deal with these fragmented regional trade blocs. Companies that were part of those early missions were able to bake their own proprietary standards into the regional regulations. It creates a moat that competitors can't cross, not because their technology is worse, but because they weren't in the room when the rules were being written. If your software architecture is the one that the government just mandated for all public utilities, you have a guaranteed market for 20 years. That is the ultimate prize of a trade mission.
I wonder how the shift toward digital trade missions is changing this. Since 2024, we have seen more virtual missions and digital delegations. The pitch was that this would democratize access, right? No more expensive flights or five-star hotels. Does that actually happen, or does it just digitize the same gatekeeping mechanisms?
From what I have seen in the data from the last 18 months, it mostly just digitizes the gatekeeping. While it is cheaper for a small business to join a Zoom call than to fly to Singapore or Riyadh, the high-level access remains locked behind the same doors. The minister is not doing a group Zoom with 40 small businesses. They are still having a private, encrypted call with the leads of the major conglomerates. The digital format actually makes it easier to exclude people because there are no hallway conversations. You can't accidentally bump into a minister in a digital lobby. The old boys club didn't disappear, it just moved to a private server with better encryption.
It seems like a very cynical cycle. The government needs the corporations to maintain national economic indices and a technological edge, especially as we see this 2026 trend of techno-nationalism. And the corporations need the government to provide the muscle and the insurance to enter risky markets. But where does this leave the actual taxpayer or the consumer? We are the ones funding the ECAS and paying for the diplomatic corps.
It leaves the taxpayer in a position where they are often unknowingly subsidizing the global expansion of companies that may not even have their best interests at heart. If a mission results in a massive contract that keeps a domestic factory open, that is the talking point the politicians use. They will stand in front of a flag and talk about jobs. But if that contract was secured by providing low-interest loans that the public has to back, the long-term cost might outweigh the immediate benefit of those jobs. We have to start looking at the gap between the memorandum of understanding signed during the trip and the actual final investment decision made 18 months later.
That is a great metric. You often see headlines about a $20 billion trade mission, but when you check back 2 years later, only $2 billion of that has actually turned into real projects. The rest was just aspirational noise designed for a press release to make the administration look effective.
If you want to understand the true priorities of a country's foreign policy, don't look at the speeches given at the United Nations. Those are for the history books. Look at the delegation lists of their trade missions. Look at which CEOs are sitting next to the Commerce Secretary on the plane. That tells you who the government actually considers to be a strategic partner. We touched on this in episode 1361 regarding the hidden art of multilateral diplomacy, but trade missions are where that diplomacy gets a price tag. It is where the abstract concepts of alliance and cooperation are converted into concrete, steel, and fiber optic cables.
It is also worth looking at the annual reports of the export credit agencies, like Daniel suggested we look at in his prompt. If you see a massive spike in state-backed insurance for a specific sector, like deep-sea mining or specialized semiconductor manufacturing, you can bet there is a major trade mission being planned to the regions where those resources are located. It is almost predictive.
It is entirely predictive. The finance follows the policy, but the policy is often written by the people who need the finance. One thing that has become clear in 2026 is that as the world fragments into these competing trade blocs, the North American bloc, the Eurozone, the various Asian coalitions, the role of the state in business is only going to increase. We are moving away from a world of truly free markets and toward a world of managed trade where your success depends as much on your relationship with your own government as it does on the quality of your product. It is a return to a more sophisticated form of mercantilism.
That is a sobering thought for anyone who believes in a meritocratic global economy. If the sales funnel is controlled by the state, then the best lobbyist wins, not necessarily the best engineer or the most efficient producer. It changes the nature of competition entirely.
That is the reality of the on-the-ground operations. When these missions land, the schedule is packed from 6 in the morning until midnight. There are state dinners, private briefings, and site visits. Every minute is choreographed to maximize the influence of the lead corporations. It is a high-performance machine. If you are a listener who works in a medium-sized business, my advice is to be very careful before spending your budget on one of these official missions. Unless you already have a connection to the political leadership, you are likely just paying to be a background character in someone else's success story. You are the crowd in the background of the minister's photo op.
So what should people be looking for if they want to track the actual outcomes of these missions? You mentioned the gap between the memorandum and the final investment decision. What else should we be watching as we move through 2026?
Transparency in the delegation lists is the biggest one. We should be demanding to know not just which companies went, but how much they have contributed to the presiding officials. We also need to monitor the default rates on export credits. If the public is de-risking these deals, the public should know when those deals go south. There is a tendency to socialize the losses while privatizing the gains, and trade missions are the primary vehicle for that dynamic. If a project in a high-risk region fails, the corporation walks away with their insurance payout, and the taxpayer is left holding the bag for a half-finished bridge or a defunct power plant.
It also seems important to watch the regulatory follow-up. If a trade mission to a specific country is followed by a change in that country's environmental or labor laws that happens to benefit the visiting companies, that is a massive red flag. It suggests that the mission wasn't just about selling goods, but about exporting a specific regulatory environment that favors incumbents over local competition or public safety.
That is the ultimate goal of commercial diplomacy. It is about creating a world that is safe for your specific brand of capitalism. The necessity of government leadership in these missions is often framed as a way to protect national interests, but we have to ask whose interests are actually being served. Is it the interest of the thousands of small businesses that make up the backbone of the economy, or is it the interest of the 5 or 6 firms that have the ear of the Prime Minister? In 2026, the answer is increasingly the latter.
It feels like we are heading toward a future where these missions will become even more essential as geopolitical fragmentation increases. If the world is divided into camps, you need your government to open the door to the other camps. As the saying goes, if you aren't at the table, you're on the menu. But the real question for our listeners is, who actually gets a seat at the table?
And who is paying for the meal? We are seeing a resurgence of mercantilism, just with better technology, more sophisticated branding, and digital platforms. The digital trade missions of 2026 are just the latest iteration of a very old game. The state and the corporation are in a dance, and while they might step on each other's toes occasionally, they are usually moving to the same beat. It is a beat that is often deafening to the concerns of the average citizen.
I think we have given people a lot to chew on regarding the actual mechanics here. It is not just a trip, it is a coordinated exercise in state power for private gain. It is the machinery of the global economy working exactly as it was designed to, even if that design isn't what we were taught in Economics 101.
It is. And for those interested in the broader context of how this plays out in specific regions, I'd suggest checking out episode 1331, where we looked at the Israel-EU nexus. It shows a similar web of trade agreements and scientific cooperation that functions beneath the surface of formal diplomacy. It is all part of the same ecosystem of managed trade.
That is a good one to revisit. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure we give people some practical ways to keep an eye on this. Beyond the ECA reports and the delegation lists, what is one thing a regular person can do to see through the spin of the next big trade announcement?
Follow the lobbyists. In many jurisdictions, lobbying disclosures are public. If you see a major firm ramping up its meetings with the Department of Trade or Commerce right before a major international mission is announced, you have found the architect of the trip. The mission didn't start in the minister's office. It started in a lobbying firm 3 blocks away. The itinerary was likely drafted by the corporation's government relations team before the civil servants even saw it.
Simple and effective. Well, I think that covers the ground Daniel wanted us to explore. It is a complex system, but once you see the gears, the glossy brochures start to look a lot different. You start to see the price tags attached to the handshakes.
They certainly do. It is all about the grease that makes the wheels turn, and in 2026 that grease is a mix of political influence and state-backed credit.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping our own wheels turning. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the infrastructure of this show.
We couldn't do it without that support.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, leaving a review on your podcast app is one of the best ways to help us reach more people who want to live behind the curtain of global power.
We really appreciate the feedback and the prompts. Keep them coming.
We'll be back soon with another prompt. Until then, keep looking at the fine print and questioning the photo ops.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.